Should we start? All right, okay, yeah. So, in principle, we are still doing it in the union room. Yeah, it doesn't matter after that where we do it. In principle, yeah. So yes, so I was citing Ambedkar from Annihilation of Caste, which is a text from that crucial year that I'm going to come to, 1936. And Ambedkar makes this comprehensive methodological opening into the nature of knowledge. And he speaks of principles as different from rules. So in the enunciation of principles, which is marked by the responsibility of that enunciation, in that sense, a thinkable form put into language for which the subject of enunciation takes responsibility. That opens up further challenges, which are constitutive challenges, institutional challenges, practical challenges. And that is, for every principle, which are the rules that have to be applied to a particular area of life. So an area of life which could be education, and an area of life which could be religion, an area of life which is economy. But for each area of life, which is the principle concerned, which then can be translated into appropriate rules. But Ambedkar also looks at this problem, looks at this issue from the other angle, which is that what is the exigency of enunciating a principle? What is it that compels us to think of new principles? Why is it not that we have ready-made great universal principles already there as part of a tradition, for instance? Why is it that despite great traditions of all societies, in specific historical conjunctures, we actually need to risk new principles, new truths? And to that extent, Ambedkar says that we don't start with the principle, we start with a problem. So, I would write then these two key words together, which are also part of the title of my seminar course, which is principle and problem. Principle and problem. So what is a problem? The principle we have provisionally, we understand it as a thinkable universal form with a certain universality both in terms of its language but also in terms of its propositional character. In other words, principles underlie forms of knowledge. But what is a problem? A problem is a particular threshold of a field of principles, field of knowledges, systems of propositions, but that threshold is a threshold of crisis. That threshold is a threshold in which some of those principles are not working anymore. Some of the systems are short-circuiting. So let us take an example, one from Ambedkar's own time and one from our time. In Ambedkar's own time, and this is not an example I'm going to repeat after this because that's not really what I'm going to study with you people over the next couple of months. But I'll take this example just to illustrate the point. In 1946, Ambedkar makes a speech to the Scheduled Caste Federation, which is an organization after the Independent Labour Party that he formed. And this is on the communal question in India, on the question of what Ambedkar calls a communal majority that dominates, not just dominates, but it absolutely has Indian society in stranglehold. But he gives the principle for this question and the problem as it confronts society. What is the problem? The problem is that in democracy, where we have elections, the majority that are formed out of elections are meant to be not a communal majority, which is fixed, but a political majority, which is flexible. So by definition, a electoral majority, that is a majority which wins an election, is meant to be flexible. So today a particular majority might come into power, tomorrow some other majority might come into power. That's why Ambedkar says we must distinguish between a political majority and a communal majority. So this is in principle. So if you have democracy, then in principle the game of elections must yield in different situations different majorities. Hence, by definition, a political majority is a changeable majority. But Ambedkar says the problem is that, so we are distinguishing between problem and principle. In democracy, the principle is that there must be a majority which is political, that is changeable. In the game of election, it actually expresses itself, or it should express itself, if it's a real democracy. But the problem is that, Ambedkar says in 1946, that in India, the real majority, the effective majority, is a communal majority, which means that irrespective of which election is held in what circumstance, by and large, not literally, but by and large, it's the communal majority which still holds power, which every time usurps or has a stranglehold on power. So between the political majority and the communal majority, there is a problematic, even a conflictual relationship or a conflictual encounter. When the political majority in principle should be changeable, the actual experience of a majority is a communal majority, and insofar as it is a communal majority, it is a falsification of the fundamental principle of democracy, according to Ambedkar. So please, all of this is debatable. So you could say, no, in India, we have, today at least not a communal majority, or you could say it's a terribly communal majority. All of this is debatable. But all I'm doing is illustrating Ambedkar's his analysis between a problem and a principle. The principle of democracy and the problem of society in India as democracy is sought to be practiced through elections in 1946. And of course, then Ambedkar will give a whole set of measures, whole set of rules to how to compensate or how to overcome this problem. So then, of course, you see, and this is the reason I give you this example. Ambedkar will say that the way to overcome this problem is that irrespective of who wins an election, we must have safeguards for minorities within political representation, not just administrative and education representation, but for political representation, for which you also need a principle. So what is the principle? One of the principles, according to Ambedkar, is that for the minority, that is a minority which has a certain percentage in the population, which is a minority which is less than 50% percentage of being part of the population, you must have a super added percentage of representation, which means if the minority is a minority of say 20% in the population, then its representation must not be merely proportionate, that is 20%. It must be more than 20%. Just like the majority, which by definition is more than 50%, must have less than its proportionate representation. Only then, Ambedkar says, irrespective of electoral results, because in a situation of communal majority, electoral results will reflect a communal majority, according to Ambedkar. We must have within the political class a new principle, which is a principle of a kind of super added intensity of representation. So this is something he's suggesting in 1946. Of course, none of that actually happens in Indian democracy after 1947. That's a different question. I'm not going into that question. We can take it up in some other discussion. But this is an example of how a principle works and how it is challenged by a problem. A second example from our times, a little more economic in nature, which is unfolding as we speak. So we have the proposal by the government, the present day government, but also now by the Congress, of a universal basic income for, in principle, all the citizens, all the Indians, a universal basic income. Now, a universal basic income either means that it is indeed what it is, which is in principle a minimum income for everyone. So a certain amount of money that is given to through bank account or whatever to all the citizens of the country. But then we also know that there is a certain kind of oscillation in the current discussions that are going on after Congress took some initiative here, whether it is indeed a universal basic income or it is a targeted basic income for the poor. Now you see, there are two principles involved. One principle is the principle of a kind of economic equality across the board, which is all Indian citizens taken individually must enjoy a basic minimum income, and that must be made available by the government. And the other one is a somewhat different principle, which is that a certain section of the population which does not have access to basic minimum income, which correspond to some kind of a poverty line, some idea of poverty, must be targeted specifically, and that very amount must be compensated. That is, if their money income falls short by a certain percentage, that percentage must be supplied, and to that extent the threshold must be crossed by everyone. So to that extent no one would remain poor. That is in the absolute sense of poverty. But of course there is a common thread to both these principles, and that common thread is some notion of equality. So if you were to speak in our times of the principle behind the universal basic income, even if the actual game of making this possible is a very different game and no one has tried it out yet, these are only proposals, and in election time we know the way to look at it is very skeptical, and rightly so. Nevertheless, the principle is something like economic equality, but understood through what could be called a methodological individualism. So it is not economic equality in the sense of class. It is economic equality in the sense of every single Indian or citizen. But of course, if you take the other one, which is the poor, then the principle is a class. The class which is poor, they must be targeted. And yet, some notion of economic equality is the principle that is guiding both these proposals. Now you can ask yourself that is this kind of a principle of some kind of economic equality, whether understood through individual methodological individualism or some notion of collective class category, is this then a new principle of something like democracy? Is there a genealogy of the principle of economic equality understood through, say, a measure of universal basic income? Now, initially you would think that no, it is a new idea in the modern times, which is that of economic equality between people. But then, you know, and again, the nature of the principle is that this is fundamental. Human beings must have basic income as enjoying the right to economic equality, which also, obviously, is also a right to something like material decent life, some sort of a decent life. Nothing beyond it. But if you do a kind of genealogy of this principle, if such a genealogy is possible, and go back to this question of universal basic income, whether in other societies which are not apparently democratic or in the modern sense democratic, then you find that in certain old societies, in ancient societies, for instance in Greek society, even partly in Roman society, there was a practice which was called Eurgetism in Rome, and a practice which was called liturgy in Greece, in Athens, which actually did, at least at one part of that practice in 5th century BC, was almost the same as the measure that we are talking about today. A fund was instituted by the government, the Athenian government, which was called Theoric, and that fund was exactly a universal basic income meant for all the citizens, irrespective of poor, whether they are poor or rich. So a threshold of a minimum income available to everyone. Now up to here it seems okay, this was also part of some kind of Athenian democracy, so you know, democracy being some concern with equality as a principle, so it's an example of that. But actually it was not. When you read about it, then you realize the reason why this kind of a universal dole, so at that time you could think of it as a universal dole was to be given to all the citizens, was that this dole was a kind of symbolic monetary unit which was given to everyone so that every citizen could now use that money to take part in certain civic activities, certain activities of the city. So for instance, grain, food that is, grain was to be bought with this money. So the reason so you could also say that, okay, this is a kind of, subsidy. So you get food grain at a cheap price, like in PDS, public distribution system. Now that would work only if it were for the poor, rations for the poor. But no, this is for everyone. All citizens, rich or poor, would be given that money so that they can pay out of it for grain. They could all attend the theatre as a civic activity. They could all now, out with that money, hand over a part of that money to a section of the citizenship which was take part in jury service. Because you understand a jury. Jury is not part of the legal officers. Jury is part of the ordinary citizens who take part in a case. Which means these are public activities. These are, in other words, public services which are being made possible through this universal dole. This universal dole. So now the principle is completely changed. The principle is not that of equality at all. It is equality, but not as a fundamental principle. Equality is only an actual measure of money equality to facilitate or to make possible another principle, which is that citizens are obliged to participate. So even eating in Greek society, as far as citizens eat, is not a simple nutrition. It is a kind of civic activity. So all of them must eat as part of some kind of an engagement with their bodily existence, which has to be now made nutritionally capable of participating in the city. For instance, taking part in games. They must take part in jury service. They must go to the theatre. And so on and so forth. So that the principle now is not that of equality. The principle is that of the obligation to participate. So the same measure, which is universal basic income in today's time, has a genealogy, but the principle changes. So these are some methodological twists and turns that I think we need to keep in mind when we discuss principles, because principles are they never exist in isolation. They're already part of a series and a configuration of problems, and those problems have specific historicities. So that's why we need to place the truth of a principle with the practices of history. Now we come to the third question, the question of question. That is, when a problem puts a principle at risk, and you need to change the principle, you need to take the risk of new principles, then is the new principle enunciated as a kind of neutral, academic, intellectual exercise? No. The enunciation of new principle is an intervention into the existing field of problems. And every intervention is, in some way or another, the creation of a subject. So that's why I want to put a third term here: problem, principle, and the subject. The subject is that moment of enunciation. The subject is that gesture. The subject is that risk where a new principle is being tried out. But a new principle is being tried out not for the sake of pleasure of the principle. It's being tried out precisely because there is an impasse, there is a certain short-circuiting between existing principles and a threshold of a new problem. But the one who takes the risk of a new principle is the new subject. Now, the real interest of this course, in what I'm trying out, and I'll go very slowly, so probably I'll never reach that point where my real interest can actually be, fully explored. Still, let me at least state it to you. The real interest in my case is, and there a comparison is also at stake between Marx and Ambedkar, in their very different histories and across the vast distance that separates those histories. Nevertheless, it is to explore the comparability and the contestation between the two subjects. And here I mean the subject of a Marxist organization and the subject of an Ambedkarite organization. But I must reach that subject only when I'm able to show us that a new principle is at stake from the Ambedkarite angle or from the Marxist angle within a historical field of problems. So I must reach that point only when I've cleared the initial ground. Otherwise, all I'll be doing is to give you my opinion. And that would be really abusing your time. So I will not do that, but you must also be patient with the investigation. But this is what is the interest of what I'm trying to do here. To repeat as a kind of summarizing exercise, the question of the principle is a question of truth. The question of truth as it is placed in a history of problems, given the singularity and the specific experience of a problem, the gesture of a new principle, which is a gesture coming from what I will call not an organized subject, but a subject of organization. Because an organized subject would mean you already know what an organization is. In my view, an organization is a question to be asked in the view of this relationship of a problem and a principle. To that extent, organization is the real philosophical problem of our times. This is my hypothesis. This is what I'm going to try out. The real philosophical threshold is the question of organization. But to reach that point, I need to conduct a number of initial exercises. So today, I want to conduct 2 exercises. And I want to do this over around 50 minutes to an hour so that we have some time for questions and discussion. So the first exercise I want to do is to, more or less, though in a fragmentary way, to present to you a narrative based on certain sources of Ambedkar in 1936 when he founds, at a particular conjuncture, the Independent Labour Party. And so, in a way, even before I have done my own work towards looking at organization in our times, I have to already look at organization in Ambedkar's own work. So to that extent, all the hypotheses are already being tested on historical ground. That is, in 1936, when Ambedkar actually founds the new party, Independent Labour Party. What is going on at that time? Though this is going to be a very, very brief and very unfinished historical narrative, nevertheless, I believe some of the key questions that I've pointed out and the key short circuits that I'm looking at would emerge in this narration. There are several sources for this narration, but today I'm taking help from Eleanor Zelliott's really pioneering work, Ambedkar's World, and her recounting of the several organizational experiments that Ambedkar conducted. But there is a fascinating supplementary source, which I'll quote only once, which is actually a literary source, though it appears as a very serious, and it is a serious biography in English, which is Dhananjay Keer's biography of Ambedkar in English. But if you read Dhananjay Keer's writing, then the pleasure you take in it is also the pleasure of a kind of literary felicity, a literary expression. And the citation, which is also going to paraphrase because I can't read in the slide, that citation will show us how Keer thinks of Ambedkar's relationship with organization. So the narration first. So this is the first narration. The second narration is with Marx, which will be a narration from 1857. But I will come to that. First, Ambedkar. So, Ambedkar's founding of the Independent Labour Party is something which, of course, to just complete the discussion of sources, Some and a lot of these sources are there in Ambedkar's collected works, brought out by the government of Maharashtra, the ILP sources and other organizational documents. But see, one of the great things that I'm trying out with you people is also organizing and arranging the documents. And much of the documents I myself have only very vague familiarity with. It is not as if I mastered the field and then I'm coming to you and giving you the sort of violently asking you to, follow the field. Not at all. Not at all. It's the other way around. I have extremely hesitant vacillating knowledge of some of the key indexes in this field, including Ambedkar's own work and Marx's work and other works. But I am trying to arrange those texts, and as I go along, I hope to read these texts and arrange them and rearrange them with you. That is the discursive and archival effort that I want to try out with you. It is not at all a question of actually repeating or replicating a great archive, whether a Marxist one or an Ambedkarite one, before you. So please keep that in mind. So in that effort, the ILP sources which are contained in some of the volumes, volume 17 of the Ambedkar's collected works, are actually, some of the sources are not very clearly ready indexed for us. So I myself haven't read everything. So there is one source which I'll only mention today, but I'll read it in one of the later classes, which is called A Bill to Reform Money Lending in the Maharashtra villages at that time. But that's not a text that I'm going to read, but it's easily available in volume 17. The text that I'm going to look at today, the document, is actually a Times of India advertisement, a kind of statement that ILP, Independent Labour Party, brought out in 1936 in the Times of India. And long citations of it are found in Eleanor Zeliot. So I am more or less today going with the citations from Zeliot. Now, in the citations from Zeliot, from ILP's platform statement, kind of advertisement of what is the agenda of the party and what are the principles behind that agenda, we find something which is very interesting, and that is, in a way, to cut to the chase, exactly from where the idea of what I'm, putting to you in a very sort of rambling fashion. In a way, the idea was born with reading this fact. And the fact is this, that in this statement, Ambedkar, among many things, asks for a dismantling and a reform and eventual abolition of what was called the Vatan system in Maharashtra. And he says that the ILP is going to work towards strong reform and eventually a dismantling of the Vatan system. And we get a vague sense from whatever few sources we have that Vatan system is a kind of system which is a village system where certain communities, and among those communities in Maharashtra, a particular community called the Mahar community, which is considered to be untouchable by the upper castes and is part of the depressed classes in the list of depressed classes brought out by the Government of India Act 1935, which is crucial to the background here in 1935, because this is happening in 1936, you must remember. This caste, Mahar caste, among other castes, but prominently Mahar caste, is obliged under the Vatan system to perform certain services. Not wage-earning labor, not money-earning labor, but something which is in the nature of services. In other words, something which it is obliged to do, something which it has a debt to perform. But a debt, not in the sense of money debt. Here we are not speaking of money debt. Of course, money lending is very important, but that's private money lending. We are not going to talk about it today, but that's a very complicated problem, which is running up to the present. We'll talk about it. But right now, I'm talking about the Vatan system. And the Vatan system is, it seems, at a very, very general level, a system of village services, a system of public services. So I already mentioned to you the example of public services. The Vatan system is also a system of public services which is certain set of communities which belonged to erstwhile untouchable castes as considered by the upper castes were meant to perform. So, and this is the key point here, they do not have the structural or the theoretical status of wage earning labor. They have the status of something which is subjective, which is an obligation, which is a certain kind of relationship to the village system or the system of society in which they're meant to perform certain functions, and they're meant to perform them repeatedly or repetitively, but that repetition has no theoretical status. What does that mean? It means those repetitions do not earn them any exchange value. That is, they don't repeat those activities so that they earn a money, an amount of money. The repetition is as if in every repetition they actually directly serve some people, some community, some idea of the village itself. So every time the service is performed, it is as if the village system is in that service fully strengthened or fully justified. So it is a kind of direct consumption of the service. The service is not put in the market. The service is not put at a certain level of mediation such that you can say, this is the price of the service. This is the amount that I am supposed to pay as an exchange value of that service. The service is the direct transplanting of certain life activities into a social system. And this, of course, is concretely illustrated by several sources. Alexander Robertson, a British bureaucrat, wrote in the first half of the 20th century a whole series of investigations and ethnographic descriptions of the Mahar community. He called it the Mahar folk. The book he called the Mahar folk. There he gives you a list of jobs that the Mahar community is supposed to perform. And in the list of jobs, it is very interesting that each job is a job which is undertaken as service, but every service is an engagement with the fact of the village population. Which means what? Which means one of the jobs, for instance, of the Mahar community is, as an obligation, is that they must guard the boundaries of the village. But how to guard the boundaries of the village? To guard the boundaries of the village, they must actually keep a tab. They must profile. So I'm deliberately using language from the securitarian system of thinking in our times, but it's more or less exactly that. They must keep a tab on everyone that is crossing the boundary. They must keep a tab on and profile the ones who are coming and going. So what they must do is to do a kind of mapping, a kind of ethnography of populations. So the principle for the Mahar is population. That a population is traveling from here to there, and you must keep a tab on the population. And to that extent, the Mahars are responsible for a very traditional service in Indian villages, extending to Indian towns and cities, which is Chaukidar, watchmen. Mahars are watchmen. But the obligation is not simply to watch. To watch means to keep a tab on the population. And this is something the Mahars must continuously do. But, you know, this is the trick here. There's a trick here. The moment you start following a particular service, you think, okay, it is a kind of specialization at the level of service. But it gives you a logic of specialization, that the Mahars are supposed to specialize in a kind of surveillance as watchmen over populations. But in a moment you realize that actually the Mahars are equally obliged to do several other things which are not in the nature of this kind of a surveillance of population at all. The Mahars are equally obliged to provide for the upper castes a continuous supply of, they are supposed to be messengers. So every time there is the news of something happening in a village, in an upper caste family, it needs to be taken to the next village or to someone, to whom the news has to be taken. The Mahar person will take it. And the third is, the Mahar is a kotwal. So the Mahar is also someone who is a police official who also keeps a tab on populations, but not only at the level of the boundary, but house to house. And so a whole gamut of activities are prescribed as part of an obligation to Mahar, but none of this is part of what we understand to be wage labor. Of course, the kind of return that the Mahars have is a mixed kind of a bag of returns. So some of it is in kind, some of it could be in money, but it remains within a system of what is called emoluments. It is not wage. It is a kind of gratuity, if you want, a kind of gift. But it's not just a question of gift. There are also privileges which are communitarian privileges. Now, privileges is a misword, because you can think of privileges only from the side of privileged communities, upper caste. Here, privileges mean concessions. So, for instance, the Mahars are allowed sometimes to live in places where they don't have to pay rent. So, it is not really a privilege. It is a kind of concession, a kind of subtraction from the usual economic circuit. So, this is a range of activities that the Mahar performs. So none of them is specialized. None of them is in the image of a particular laboring capacity. Here I am using Marx's term, though we don't have to bring Marx right now, but let's use the term because it's a very illustrative term. Marx speaks of labor as a capacity, a kind of laboring capacity. From Grundrisse, but also in Capital, in other places. None of this is a question of a laboring capacity. Because it cannot be. Because with the Mahar, at every moment the job is changing. So what the Mahar seems to be actually embodying is a kind of ontological availability. The Mahar in his being is available. The Mahar's time is not his time. It is the upper caste's time. At every moment, the Mahar is available to go and deliver a message, to do the kotwal's work, to be the village. So it is also in a kind of biopolitical sense extremely granulated. So one of the capacities, so it is a capacity, but what kind of a capacity is it is the question. One of the capacities that the Mahar is supposed to have is the capacity to recognize a thief by his footsteps. Because a Mahar follows a thief across the village, and when the thief is supposed to be running away and crossing the village. So a Mahar should have the capacity to almost recognize a thief, if not by face, by footsteps, by the nature of the gait. So to that extent, the Mahar is expected to have extraordinary capacity. But, and that is Ambedkar's question in the ILP manifesto, does he have the form of capacity? He is expected to have capacity as empirical, some skills which are extraordinary. Availability, which requires a kind of lifelong 24-hour discipline, which amounts to a kind of slavery also. But of course, it is not necessarily only that of a low slave ranking, because the Mahar also needs education. So one of the routes to which, and Ambedkar's own family, his father will go that route, will be the route of the Mahar entering the military, when the option is given to them by the British government. So there is a whole military possibility for the Mahar, which is very important to Ambedkar. Ambedkar, towards the end of his life, said that he wanted to write a military history, something he couldn't finish, or couldn't do actually. So there is something enormously interesting about this desire to write a military history. Why would you want to write a military history? In my opinion, military history as a part of this larger history of service. Not military history in the sense of military as an embodiment of a kind of brute nationalism, not at all. So anyway, that speculation apart. The Mahar's service, or the logic of service, is a logic of extreme empirical, positive, ethnographic granulation. So the Mahar is described in ethnographic detail, everything that a Mahar is supposed to know or has the possibility of knowing or doing. But the Mahar does not have a theoretical status of labor. This brought me through Ambedkar's proposal in ILP that the Watan system must be abolished to the question of what I call the principle of labor. So it seemed to me that ILP, and we'll talk about ILP a little more in a moment, ILP has a paradoxical status. On the one hand, ILP is Independent Labour Party, which means it is a labour party. Its main form is to organize people on the basis of their work as labour, as wage workers. And at the same time, and it's independent, which means it is not part of, say, the Congress labour organizations and the other labour organizations, including the Communist Party organizations. It is independent, and the meaning of independent is surely also that within the labour, the depressed classes must be separately articulated. The problems of the depressed class labouring people must be articulated. But in doing that, there is also something which is a further and at the same time a more preliminary demand, which is not the demand of organizing the labour as a subject of rights, but to make available to a certain population, which is the population of depressed classes and untouchable castes, the principle of labour. So ILP is based on a kind of enforcement of the principle of labour insofar as it is a party which has a whole list of campaign points. So this is the first summary point that I'd like you to consider. Now, to just get a background of this enforcement, it is a very interesting conjuncture, 1936, for Ambedkar. The conjuncture is this. In 1936, there has happened a crucial conference, which is the Depressed Classes Conference at Bombay, Mahar Conference at Bombay. And in that conference, the Mahars have passed a formal resolution that they are not interested in being Hindus anymore, and they're open to converting. So actually, something like a decisive, subjective desire has been objectively formulated as part of the Mahar Convention in 1936. It is in 1936 that on the other side, the greatest Ambedkarite text, Annihilation of Caste, is going to be produced under extremely contested conditions when he is supposed to make a speech at Lahore, which is going to be cancelled sine die. Nevertheless, the text will come out as a speech, but a speech which was never delivered, called Annihilation of Caste. In between all of this, there is ILP. Now, Annihilation of Caste is a text which contains all the critical features of the discussion on caste, including the discussion of caste and class. But it also contains extremely crucial discussions of caste and religion. So in a sense, Annihilation of Caste is a comprehensive and even avant-garde theoretical text on the question of caste as a question of annihilation. But in ILP, so it has religion, it has the question of economy, and it places the category of caste at the center, and we'll enter into each of these discussions as we go along. But in ILP manifesto, there is absolutely no mention of anything to do with the social form of religion. Forget the theological form, because Ambedkar was hardly interested in the theological form of religion ever, at least from his side. He was making critiques of theology in Hindu theology, but not theology as something he affirmed. But not even this was mentioned, even as a social form, as far as religion is concerned, in ILP manifesto. Nevertheless, ILP was not a general manifesto for the labouring population. It was a manifesto which had a methodological separatism at its center. That is, we must both make an independent labour party, but we must also introduce the difference within labour, which is the difference between the depressed classes labour, which is excluded from the principle of labour, and the subject of labour, which is the working class as a class. So he introduced the difference itself, both substantive and methodological, within the manifesto. So one of the examples of the introduction of the difference was, of course, the introduction of the principle of labor through the abolition of the Watan system. Now, the fact is that the Watan system was not abolished in Ambedkar's own lifetime. It was abolished in probably 1959, that late, by an act called the Bombay Inferior Watan Abolition Act. Nevertheless, again and again, Ambedkar made efforts to see that this act was weakened, if not abolished, the Watan system, that is. So in that effort, there was huge conferences. One happened in Ahmednagar, and it was part of the 1937 provincial elections in Bombay Presidency. So one of the things we need to keep in mind is that the ILP is actually fighting elections, and this is happening at a time when Ambedkar has already gone into one of the most puzzling and at the same time unavoidable episodes of Indian history, modern Indian history, which is his face-off with Gandhi over Gandhi's Pune fast against the separation of electorates. He has gone through that. And under the new reserved system of elections with primaries, the first election that is to be held in 1937, ILP is fighting that election. And on these particular points, so the abolition of the Watan system, and also with what I don't have the time to talk about, but a very important abolition, again, which is a tenancy act called the Khoti system, a kind of tenancy act, is also part of their agenda in certain parts of Ratnagiri and Maharashtra and Gujarat. But I'm not going to talk about that. All of this is part of the election. And actually, as part of the reserved seats, they do pretty well. ILP does pretty well. They win some 8 or 9 seats. Congress gets just 2 seats reserved. But of course, among the general seats, Congress does better. But ILP also fights the general election. That is, election for the general seats. Now, this is very important because at this point, what ILP is doing is that it is trying to make a particular combination of caste Hindus, Mahars and non-Mahar untouchable castes as a kind of configuration of forces. This much you can see. But what is fascinating and what leads us to actually ask the question of organization in the first place is that what is the nature not of ILP merely, but nature of organizations as such in the middle of 1930s. And this becomes particularly vivid to us, a kind of exotic picture of organization, very different from our times, when we see that the parties that actually win different seats are now sitting in the Bombay legislature, in the provincial legislature at that time, in 1938 onwards. In 1939, the government led by Congress resigns. So there's a crisis. But in between, we have the legislative sitting. Now what you get is a very strange picture, which is this, that you don't get one kind of organization merely. You get an organization like Congress, yes, which is clearly the biggest organization at that time. You get an organization like ILP, which is a labor organization but with a difference. You get an organization like Muslim League, which is a minority organization but a very, very well-established, well-marked out organization. And then you get organizations like, for instance, the Varnashram Sabha, which clearly is an upper caste Brahmanical organization, but not an organization at all in the sense of how we understand an organization to be a well-formed organization with an agenda which is meant to be implemented through certain means. Instead of that, we get organizations which are actually rooted in a long history of organizations from the 19th century on to that period, which is what could be called petitioning organizations. So Varnashram Sabha is an example, just like the other organizations are, including Muslim League, as petitioning organizations. So what is a petitioning organization? Now, the principle of a petitioning organization is that a petitioning organization does not have as its own form a form of universality. It doesn't stand for all of society. It stands for a sabha, for a samaj, for a specific corporate body, and what it does is that it presents petitions, its individual grievances in a certain petitioning form to the authority. So in the 19th century up to early 20th century, clearly the authority was the British government, the British sovereign. So petitioning organizations are organizations that start out as a self-admitted corporate organizations. They don't have any universal claim. So they don't stand for society. They don't stand for the nation. They don't stand for the people. They stand for a community identity. This is the nature of petitioning organizations. This you can see also in French history. French Revolution time, pre-revolution, you get a lot of petitioning organizations or petitioning families, petitioning communities. You get a whole list of petitions which are sent secretly directly to the king. So the king is actually getting what are called letters de cachet, secret letters, being written by a family which is saying, my neighbors are creating trouble for me. And the person is writing directly to the king, secretly. These are all petitioning forms. So in a sense, we have a very dense and fascinating web of corporate bodies which are presenting themselves as not really organizations, but as forces, petitioning forces, as discourses, somewhat subjective. But by the time we come to 1936, when this, the provincial elections are happening, 1937, we see that these petitioning forces have become partly well-formed organizations. Nevertheless, their principle is not the principle of universality. So, Varnashram Sabha does not stand for anything else but an upper caste Varnashram view of life. Now, this is not true of Congress, surely. Muslim League is different. Muslim League at least has the universality of standing for, or at least claiming to stand for, all the Muslims. So to that extent, there is a certain kind of universality, a divisive universality you might say, but still a universality. Is this true? A kind of minoritarian universality, even that is possible. And there is a very close link between Muslim League and Ambedkar's efforts at this time. That can be talked about. Zeliot has written very interesting stuff about it. We can think of all that. But when we come to Congress, we get a view of a universality which is of another order. Not only is it a universal organization standing for all the people in its own voice, as it were, but it is also not a petitioning organization anymore. So Ambedkar will write a great text in the 1940s, What Congress and Gandhi Did to the Untouchables, in which he'll analyze the nature of Congress's evolution and development, where he will show how Congress started just like any other petitioning organization, but with Gandhi's entry actually became a militant organization. What does it mean to say militant? Militant means both that you stand or you make a subjective demand on behalf of a larger totality, which is like a people, but also you say, and you hold a kind of militant demand up by saying that to power, that's to authority, that if you don't meet my demand, I will impose sanctions on you. So this is the reversal of a militant organization. So Congress, in that sense, Ambedkar himself says, is a prototype of a militant organization, where it says that the Congress says, and Gandhi actually brings in that militancy, that logic of militancy, which says that if, so a Gandhi satyagraha or a hunger strike is this, that if you don't meet our demand, we are going to undertake a hunger strike, which is to say we impose a sanction on you. Which means a militant organization actually extracts, if not usurps, power from the field of organizational politics. In that sense, first time we have a threshold of politics, insofar as the stakes are power. This is different for a petitioning organization. For a petitioning organization, there are no stakes of power. To that extent, it is not a part of politics yet. It is on the threshold, but not quite politics. So we have to distinguish then between a petitioning organization and a political organization. But it is only a schematic distinction, because in the actual provincial legislature, we see the presence of all these organizations, mixed organizations. One of which is ILP. Now what is ILP? ILP has won some elections. It has done well. In fact, Ambedkar will not do so well in any other election later. It has done a little bit, okay. It is now bringing its campaign up, and also it is undertaking militant action. So, for instance, what Ambedkar calls against the Congress, because the Congress is has a ministry in the Provincial Assembly, against the Congress, they participate in a strike in Maharashtra on the first Industrial Disputes Bill, which Ambedkar calls a bad and bloody bill. And there is a one-day strike, which they join against the Congress, different organizations, including ILP. So to that extent, ILP is actually taking part in larger mass action. At the same time, ILP is also taking up specific systemic demands like the village system as exemplified in the Watan, and the Khoti as part of a tenancy act, and reform of money lending. All of these reforms of structural reforms. And it's a mix of this kind of mass militant action and further structural reform which it is petitioning or asking the government to undertake. So it's a kind of mixed strategy or a mixed subjectivity that we see with the ILP. Now, of course, I will not go into this today because that will have to come back again and again later. The fact is, ILP has a short life. And 1942, the Scheduled Caste Federation is formed, where clearly the identity of scheduled caste being the rationale or the basis for a new organization is stated very, very unequivocally, clearly. So now we are talking of a Scheduled Caste Federation instead of ILP, which is, as I said, a difference introduced between the labor itself, which is the difference between the principle of labor as something which you have to enforce and the principle of labor as it is available to a certain part of the population, which is the upper caste population. Now, this conflict in Ambedkar is actually visible, not a conflict, but a kind of continuous engagement with this heterogeneity of one part of the population to whom the principle of labor is available and another part of the population, laboring population, to which the principle has to be enforced. This heterogeneity is something Ambedkar reflects on several occasions. So one such occasion is when Ambedkar actually addresses the depressed classes of the railroad workers in Bombay, the railway workers in Bombay, where he criticizes Brahmanism of the working class itself. He actually does that. But at the same time, he makes it clear that he is opposed to the system that you can call a kind of private appropriation which is equal to capitalism. So he's addressing the heterogeneity by also now speaking of two principles with all their internal tensions, but enunciating both of them at that time. Both the principle of something which is to oppose Brahmanism within the working class, in that sense not a class, not a seamless class, but a problematic idea of class, and at the same time opposing what this class is opposed to, which is a system of private appropriation called capitalism or capital. So both these logics we see in Ambedkar at this time, but it's a brief experiment insofar as from 1942 onwards we have a larger minority identity party called the HCF, the Scheduled Caste Federation. But the effort at producing more and more investigations of the concrete historical heterogeneity between the principle of labor and the populations who are excluded from this principle keeps happening, keeps emerging. So I will not talk about it today, but one of the fascinating chapters of this heterogeneity is when Ambedkar has a debate with M.N. Roy. Again, vis-a-vis a strike of mills in Bombay, where M.N. Roy opposes the strike and Ambedkar supports it. But on what grounds? That is the interesting question to look at. That I'll take up later because it actually addresses something which is a very important question of how organizational questions vis-a-vis the questions of larger strategy. So what M.N. Roy had in mind was a larger strategy. What Ambedkar wanted was an immediate response to a problem. So there was a certain, there was a certain difficulty there. But that we will take up later, or you can bring it up in discussion. Now, given these narrative strands, given these, little episodes in the story, we can, for the moment, make a provisional conclusion that in Ambedkar, the question of the principle of labor, and to that extent the question of class, was a question of enforcement of the class, not the existence of the class, not the existence of the principle, but the enforcement of the principle. To enforce what does not exist. This seems to me to be one of the strongest imperatives that lies at the heart of some of the demands and some of the moves made in the ILP, the ILP platform, the Indian Labour Party platform. So that is a very important point that I think we need to keep in mind before we discuss the relationship of what this principle is by reading Marx. But insofar as we can make an intuitive, at least an intuitive grasp, that something like a principle of labor, where labor is understood to be wage work, and that free wage work is unavailable to a section of the laboring population, in this case Mahar population. In Ambedkar's proposals for ILP, there is a demand, or a desire at least, to enforce this non-existence, that this class does not exist, enforce it, and see if it's possible. So this enforcement clearly is both vis-a-vis the government, but also vis-a-vis the class itself. This is the important thing. Whether it fails or succeeds, at this point, the imperative, the demand, the desire needs to be noted, which in my mind hasn't been noted sufficiently. Maybe Zeliot has done it, some others, but not sufficiently. That there is a demand to enforce something which does not exist, which is something like the principle of labor, or you could say class, the logic of class. Now, you will of course ask me, and rightly so, that, and we don't have the time to, elaborate that, but in discussion we can take it up, because I'll just spend 20 minutes on Marx and finish. But you will ask me that what is the relationship of the ILP documents with the razor-edged formulations, which are theoretical formulations of annihilation of caste, particularly the third and the fourth sections of annihilation of caste in the beginning itself, when Ambedkar very clearly takes up the question of caste vis-a-vis its several models, several explanations that people have offered. For instance, a socialistic response to caste, a religious response to caste, and an economistic response to caste, which says that caste is a kind of, Savarnashram is a kind of division of labor. It's a kind of division of occupations. And of course also a racial model of caste, that caste is a kind of race theory. And point by point, model by model, Ambedkar refutes why each of these theories are actually false, or have a very weak core at least. But also, and that's very important, particularly vis-a-vis debate with socialists, he also points out why this weak core also makes the ameliorative or the emancipatory proposals strategically and logically wrong or inadequate. So for instance, and this has to be said very clearly because you can read it very clearly, he speaks against the socialists by saying that your general prescription of amelioration or emancipation is that of proletariat revolution. And what is proletariat revolution? Proletariat revolution is the revolution which effects or effectively means seizing of power. So in that sense, a political revolution. And he asks something enormously significant. He says, but what will be a post-revolutionary life like? And he says, there is no satisfactory answer coming from the socialists. And to that extent, he fears that a post-revolutionary life will be a casteist life, a Brahmanical life. And to that extent, this idea of a proletariat revolution as such in this prescription is, in annihilation of caste, very strongly opposed. Now, there is something fascinating here. On the one hand, this is very clear as the light of day. On the other hand, we have an American thinker from 1960s called Hugo Tinker, whose Eliot quotes, who wrote a book in 1960s called India and Pakistan, a Political Analysis. And he says that Ambedkar's, and he singles out Ambedkar, not a communist thinker, not anyone else, not a Congress thinker, but Ambedkar. He says Ambedkar's politics is the prototype of a proletariat politics for the future. This is what he says. What does he mean? And helped by Eliot, I think there is some meaning here. Only the meaning is, for Tinker, or one meaning of proletariat, here the meaning is not the more strategic and instrumental idea of proletariat as seizing, or the subject, or the historical force, agent, which seizes state power. That is not the primary meaning of proletariat. Proletariat is something like radical mass action. That is the meaning of proletariat. Not a subject of power straight away. That might happen, might not happen, because that's a longer Leninist logic which we can come to later. We will come to it later. But something more clear, at the same time something more subjective is at stake, which is Ambedkar's relation to mass action. Now, I promised that I'm going to quote something really, really very beautiful and very evocative from Dhananjay Keer. Dhananjay Keer says, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't read in the slide, nevertheless, more or less this is what it is. Dhananjay Keer says, again speaking of organization, that Ambedkar has no taste for individual organization. So he actually uses the word taste. And indeed, it seemed to me it is so important. Organization is also a question of taste. Not everyone has a taste for organization. And that does not mean that the ones who have a taste for the organization do not think of organization in a very, not just in a hard-headed, instrumental way, but also think of organization in a profoundly sensitive way. But it's still partly a question of taste. Not everyone has a taste. So Dhananjay Keer actually says that Ambedkar did not have a taste for individual organization, or for what he calls constructing an organizational program. And yet, it flies in the face of the fact that Ambedkar was actually someone who was surrounded by the largest number of people. The only competitor clearly is Gandhi. So to that extent, how do you understand it? Because Ambedkar is not a genius, but a lonely genius, doing his or her very secret work of genius as a poet or as an artist or whatever, as a philosopher. Marx partly was like that. Partly he was sitting alone in the British Library and laboring away. Ambedkar is not that. Ambedkar, to the last day of his life, was a unmistakable public persona, public personality. To that extent, how does one make sense of a statement like that? He had no taste for organization. So we have to read further. And Dhananjay Keer says that Ambedkar's way was different. It was this. Ambedkar gave a call. Ambedkar's method was that of a call. And once he gave a call, the people came. And so this is Keer writing, where he sat became the venue of the organization and the time for a decision. And so he goes further. Ambedkar's calls were like the sudden flowering of a crop during the rainy season. In the summer, the flag lay idle in the office. So, in the literature on organizations, the role of metaphor is very important. Yes, this is something we should investigate. Hannah Arendt wrote about this. The role of metaphor in the thinkers of organization. So one of the metaphors of organization is the organic metaphor. Something like the crop growing. Organizations grow like a crop in the rainy season. In the summer, all the instruments of an organization like a flag. We know flag is such an important part of an organizational emblem. Just lies next to the office. Or, lies next to the side door of an office. But in a moment when it's rainy season, that is a conjuncture, organization grows organically, like a flower, like a crop, like a tree. This is an organic metaphor, but an organic metaphor which Dhananjay Keer applies with such relish to Ambedkar. Insofar as Ambedkar seemed to give that organic evocation or that organic call, power, as in a fecundity, as a fertility, almost like a fertility. Yeah, it's a fertility. So you could think of a gendered metaphor here somewhere. But anyway, that is a speculative discussion. But the organic metaphor is very important because there are other metaphors for organizations, no? Mechanical ones, like a machine. So one of the other organizational figures who was deeply moved by organic metaphors for organization, not mechanical metaphors at all, was a great woman again, Rosa Luxemburg. Of course, here we are not saying Ambedkar uses such a metaphor. To my knowledge, Ambedkar has not used such. Ambedkar was a fantastic writer of the English language, but this kind of a vivid metaphor, an organic metaphor, I have never read Ambedkar using. But Dhananjay Keer does it. And to that extent, he brings up this very interesting question of taste for organization. And yet, taste for organization does not mean that it's not organized. So, the point is, here proletariat means, and Zeliot approves of Tinker, proletariat means something organically radical, as in a mass action. So, proletariat means two things. Proletariat means one, which is the form of a working class which has come together as a political force, where it has either subsumed or overcome through a kind of dialectical process all its negativity, all its dividing identities and so on and so forth. That is one meaning of working class. Working class as an interest-based. So proletariat as a final culmination of that working class interest. But that is a flat understanding of working class. The other meaning of working class, or the other sense of working class, sorry, not working class, the other sense of proletariat, is the moment when working classes don't exist as a class in the strict sense, that is, objective class, but they act as a class. They act conjuncturally, as kind of mass action. So, Hugo Tinker seems to be saying that Ambedkar had that capacity to trigger something like mass action, which very other few people did. So to that extent, maybe a little bit metaphorically, but Tinker spoke of Ambedkar as a prototype of proletariat politics, not any communist leader at that time. But anyway, these are not by way of conclusion. These are by way of those threads of investigation that we can take up as we go along. So finally, last 10 minutes. What is the principle of labor? How to understand the principle of labor? What is at stake when we speak of a principle of labor? Now, Marx is the first one to sober us here. Because till now, insofar as Ambedkar seems to be campaigning for the principle of labor, the principle of labor seems to be a kind of absolute idea. Marx is somebody who, in his readings of this question and his writing on this question, will actually unmask in different genres of texts, of course, we'll come to that, in different genres of text, he will unmask how this principle itself is actually only a historical form. But this history is hidden. This history is masked. So that's why Marx will say that capitalism produces a form which is historical through and through. But it is also a claim that capitalism is a supra-historical stage of history. So to that extent, all of history is actually only a kind of masked strategic plan to bring capitalism. So once capitalism is here, then all of history is useless. And to that extent, capitalism is actually a philosophy of nature, not of history. This Marx wants to unmask. And to do that, in the constituting moment of capitalism, he has to, and that is very clear, he has to actually constitute the other of capital, which is labor. So then, at its very origin, labor is between two realities. One is a pre-labor reality, which you can call service, though Marx's, and that is something very interesting, very important, very difficult, which is what is Marx's notion of service. Ambedkar's notion of service is informed by his deep experience of Maharashtra village system. And again we'll come to that. But what is Marx's concept of service? Does it come from feudalism only? Has it some meaning within capitalism? And so on and so forth. We'll come to that, not today, in the later classes. But given all these questions, this much is very clear for Marx, that labor is an other of capital without which capital can't be constituted. So in a sense, labor and capital are co-constituted, but co-constituted in a field of conflict which Marx calls dialectic. So that's why in Marx there is something which becomes a matter of great philosophical difficulty, obscurity. And again, the question of Marxist method troubles us. So Marx uses the word dialectic. And the question is this dialectic a method? Or is this dialectic the very movement of reality? So, is it a method to look at labor dialectically in relation and in opposition to capital? So, look at that through kind of objects of knowledge and science? Or is it that in history, in the very movement of history, labor and capital arise in this dialectical way? Really, that is as if they are emergences of something, what Marx through Hegel calls a real being. So is this dialectic a dialectic of real being, or is this a dialectic of forms of concepts? Now this is a very troubling question, and there is no clear answer to this. Different thinkers have given different, their own preferred solutions to this problem. So famously Louis Althusser in the 1960s will say that we have to distinguish between a pre-scientific Marx and a scientific Marx. And that pre-scientific Marx is someone who is involved in this dialectic of reality itself. And the scientific Marx constitutes the dialectic at the level of knowledge, as an object of knowledge, not to be confused with something which is real. But there is a text in between, which again and again confronts us, where we are not sure whether it should be put on the side of capital, that is in the 1960s, or it should be put on the side of economic and philosophical manuscripts and German ideology and so on, which are on the side of 1840s. 1870s side, 60s side, or 1840s side. So in 1850s, 1857 actually, the text Grundrisse confronts us and captivates us and eludes us. Why? Because, so Grundrisse in German seems to, I do not know German, so people can correct me, but by and large it seems to be notebooks or groundwork, something like groundwork. So the nature of this text, the genre of this text itself is improvised. It's an improvisational text. The moment you compare this text with capital, you see the difference. In capital, it is very simple, deceptively so, and very, very structured. It builds from simple commodity form onwards to more complicated forms and movements. This is not true of Grundrisse. Grundrisse has passages which are complicated, passages which are intuitive, and passages which are incomplete. Passages which are in the nature of notes. Now, Grundrisse makes a methodological claim, a philosophical claim, which is that it wants to study both these things. It wants to study the emergence of concepts, so labor is a concept, if it is a concept, that is, that's precisely the question. The emergence of a concept in history and the emergence of the concept as a concept in thought. And the two don't necessarily correlate. The two don't necessarily correspond. The real form and the conceptual form. And he gives very interesting metaphors again. So one of the metaphors that he gives is the metaphor of an ape. He says that it is by studying the human being at the present stage that you can actually retrospectively grasp how the human being evolved from an ape. The retrospective evolutionary process. But of course, people like Jacques Rancière have pointed out that you can also think of it from the other direction. By looking at an ape, you can project what a human evolutionary path might be. So many of these methodological intuitions and moves and wagers, which are mixed with metaphors and analogies, are not very clear. That which is really the logic that Marx adopts, which we can then debate whether we agree to it or not. It is not very clear whether it's the movement of reality or the movement of object, or both are the same, and what is the relationship between the two. But while all of this is happening, you do get one thing very, very strongly coming across to you in Grundrisse, which is a kind of, through metaphor, but also through analytical description, a kind of, so let me use a philosophical word, immanence, something which is immanent, whether at the level of the concept or at the level of reality, but something immanent. So concepts are thinking and reality is in being out there, it seems, but both seem to be processes which you do not surpass, or you do not stand above the process and make categories. To that extent, it seems, it is not a scientific text. It is a dialectical text in the sense it is trying to find a language for a dynamic process. This is the specificity of Grundrisse, which in our times has fascinated and been affirmed by a particular school of Marxist thinkers who are the Italian autonomists, led by Antonio Negri, who spent many years in jail, and several others, who have said that actually Grundrisse is the revolutionary text in Marx, not Capital. I mean, Capital is there, but Grundrisse has a specificity, a singularity, which needs to be found. Through this course, I will try to both discuss the text, but also partly criticize and question the Italian autonomist reading of Grundrisse. One of the main points on which this criticism is going to bear, I'll not make the criticism today, but I'll tell you what is one of the main points on which the criticism is supposed to come to bear. And that is that in this immanent kind of writing and reading in the Grundrisse, Marx speaks about labor in both ways. Labor as labor, that is as part of labor process. What is labor process? Labor process is the process at each of its moments when labor moves from its simple existence to something which is its relationship with everything that it comes into contact with. For instance, money, for instance, capital, for instance, instruments of labor, for instance, raw material. So in that sense, the labor process is the movement from what could be called the presupposition of labor to the result of labor. So I think I have written it down somewhere, if you can see it. From presupposition to result. This is the dialectic process for any concept, particularly labor in this case. So what is the presupposition in talking of labor? What is the process of the labor as a process, that is at every moment when labor moves through different stages? And what is the result which labor then finally achieves, which could be what? Product, capital, use value, exchange value. What is labor finally oriented to? So this is the path that dialectically the process of labor is supposed to unfold in front of us. And this is what Marx tries to undertake, this labor process. Now, the second meaning of labor, which is part of this very process, is that labor itself is a kind of power. Labor itself is a kind of capacity. I've used this term beforehand. Labor is a kind of capacity. So you can speak of laboring capacity, you can speak of labor power, laboring power, and so on and so forth. Now the question is, what is the status of this laboring capacity? Labor power. Laboring power. Let's not go to labor power, because that's a classic concept in Capital. It's absolutely sharply defined in Capital. But let's look at it intuitively, subjectively. What would we think of laboring power? Now, clearly, one of the directions in which you can think of laboring power would be that laboring power is a kind of bodily active disposition. So laboring power is a kind of disposition towards labor. So the power is realized in parts as we make things, but as such it is a kind of potential or a dispositional possibility. It's a bodily possibility. It's a kind of active bodily tendency to make, and so on and so forth. That would be one way of looking at this laboring capacity. But this, and in a way the Italian Marxists do take this very seriously and analyze this notion of capacity in the light of contemporary practices of capital, in the contemporary world of capital, that is neoliberal capitalism. Now that discussion is for a later class, so I will not talk about it today. but that is at stake. But I'll go back to Marx himself in Grundrisse. What does Marx say? He doesn't really qualify capacity as something necessarily which is a bodily tendency or a disposition. He uses these words, but they also go in another direction, which is the following: that laboring capacity is something which the worker is forced to be reduced to. Something paradoxical happens in Grundrisse. And I am referring here to notebook 3. So Grundrisse has several, notebook 1, notebook 2, notebook 3. I am referring here to the notebook 3. So in case someone wants to look up the relevant part, this is notebook 3. So in notebook 3, he says that actually, and this is paradoxical, something like laboring capacity is the exposure of the worker to his or her absolute poverty. Actually, capacity is the same thing as poverty. Why is it poverty? Because when the laborer or the worker is working, then the worker is actually not concerned with the specific form of labor that he undertakes. So historically, we have to distinguish between in my language, the principle of labor, which is the principle of labor as this general labor power or laboring capacity, and laboring capacity as specifically articulated in something which in the Greek language is called, and let me just take a moment, you can hold the mic, just write it down, which is technique. This is the Greek word, technique. Now, in the Greek language, the word technique means, of course, what it means, technique, but it also means art. Art. So the word for artist is both technitis, and the way we look at artist as someone who specifically undertakes aesthetic activity. But that difference doesn't exist in the Greek language or in a certain form of looking at labor. So Marx, without going into the Greek etymology or Greek word, actually says that the distinction between guilds and crafts and labor power as experienced in capital, vis-a-vis capital, is that it loses the nature of art. So this is Marx's own word. It loses the nature of art. Now art is both understood in the aesthetic sense, but it's also understood in the sense of something which is a particular form of labor, a particular form of work whose relationship to its end is particular. So if I'm making a piece of pottery, then I am making that piece of pottery. If I'm painting, then I am painting. I am to the end oriented towards the specificity of my labor, which is an aesthetic labor as well as a technical labor. And there the technical and the aesthetic or the artistic are not to be separated. This is what is lost in the principle of labor as such. Because in the principle of labor, labor is indifferent to its form. It's indifferent to its activity. And so you see, and to that extent, and this is something quite, it could be very disturbing when you think about it, even the artist is indifferent insofar as the artist is oriented to something like the value of art as exchange value. Now, to that extent, when we speak of this general ontological term or idea, labor as laboring capacity, we are actually, according to Marx, thinking of something negative, something specific to historical capitalism or the experience of capital, which is the denudation, which is the absolute threshold of poverty for the worker, where what the worker does is the worker himself is indifferent to. And it is at that level that the worker is actually separated from the particularity of his work, and something paradoxically, apparently very glorious emerges, which is laboring capacity. So the word capacity is misleading here, it seems. And if someone wants to affirm capacity as something creative, then it has to be done to use my earlier figure of speech, in their own voice. It can't really be done through Marx, it seems to me. But we'll talk about that later. But in Marx, this idea of the principle of labor then is an ironic idea. The principle of labor emerges only when labor is at its poorest. Labor is at its most denuded. And yet, insofar as it is a principle, it becomes thinkable. So labor becomes thinkable when labor is the most alienated. So this Marx, again, last 2 points, Marx again uses, so I'm following metaphors in their discourses, the different discourses. Marx again uses a metaphor. And a metaphor that he will use 2 times at least in Grundrisse. Both are Christian metaphors, religious metaphors. So the first time he'll say that one of the, and of course, let's put this, complete the picture here. What is at stake for Marx is not just to analyze the principle of labor as it is emerging in the experience of capital. What is equally important for Marx is to continuously demystify and unmask the knowledge of this very process. What is the knowledge of this very process? It is the knowledge called classical political economy or economics. So economics is being demystified and unmasked as not a false knowledge, but an erroneous knowledge. A knowledge essentially structured by error. And so key protagonists, great protagonists of this knowledge, some from the camp which is of free market like Adam Smith, some like Ricardo, and some from the socialist camp like Proudhon. Each of them, and others, each of them Marx discusses, and Marx is quite cruel when he shows the errors that these great thinkers commit. He is cruelly destructive of these discourses, at least in part. So one moment of such destruction, especially vis-a-vis Proudhon, is something that he does when he speaks of, and it applies as much to Ricardo, though Marx clearly has greater respect for Ricardo. One of the key moments is the notion of productivity in labor. So, you know, it's the same cluster. It's the same cluster of concepts. Productive, capacity. You can see the nature of the kind of metaphor of something which is active as a potential. So Marx says that, you know, this kind of a sentiment or a sentimental praise of labor, which, you know, very much exists with us too. Labor as praised as a kind of capacity, as productive labor. Labor is productive. He says this is either a tautology. When you say labor, you seem to mean someone who produces. So what's the point of saying productive? Labor is, insofar as it is productive. That is, it produces. But of course, that is not the meaning. When you say productive labor, you're meaning something which is labor as efficient. That is the meaning, you know, the economic meaning. That labor is efficient vis-a-vis utilization of natural resources, vis-a-vis its relationship with machinery and so on and so forth. Now, Marx says that this is a kind of statement which leads up to the contradiction or the paradox, that you say that labor's productivity is something which makes it utilize capital more efficiently and in a way translates capital so that finally you get something like a product, and product more efficiently than the earlier form of labor. So more productive. That could happen because of technology, because of labor's own, you know, several things. Disciplining, maybe also labor's working hours changing, many things are possible. Now Marx says, but this is very subtle, so you have to follow it very carefully. Marx says that you are saying, it seems, to begin with, and this is Proudhon, this is basically Proudhon. You're saying that there is something like labor which is outside capital, and then there is capital, which is like, you know, machinery, technology, all these things, and then labor is transforming that dead field of objects into something which is more efficient product. But that capital is itself labor. That machinery is itself labor. It's a form of labor. So to that extent, there is no question of saying that labor, or you're saying labor transforms itself, which is again a tautology. Because everything anyway is a transformation of labor. Now, the really important important point is that capital is not simply labor. Capital is the process of the continuous displacement of labor. So capital is neither machine as existing as kind of a dead object outside, nor is it simple labor which works on the dead object and makes it into something. Capital is a continuous displacement of this relationship. So capitalism does not exist except as a relationship. This is Marx's shattering thesis. And in a way it blows out, it blows apart this entire substantive pathos of labor as something which is a thing, which is a reality, and capital as another kind of a thing. Only difference is labor lives and capital is dead. Marx completely dismantles this sentimentality or the sentimentalism in categories by saying that capital is the displacement of the very relationship which is the social relationship including labor and capital. So we come to this very strange conclusion that yes, labor is a principle, but it is a historical principle. So it is not a principle in the way that classically a principle is meant to be, whether metaphysically or mathematically, that it is, above history, beyond history. Labor is a principle because it emerges as a form, as a universal form, but it's a universal form which emerges in history. So then it becomes a contradictory idea of a historical principle, a historical theory, or a historical abstraction. Marx used to say concrete abstraction. So, the metaphor that he uses for this illusion that economists have when they say that capital is making labor do something or labor is making capital into something. He says this is the kind of phenomenon that in Christianity is called transubstantiation. In Christianity, one of the miracles that is supposed to be effected during a ritual, Eucharistic ritual, is bread will turn into body. Wine will turn into blood. The substances will change through the miracle. So in that sense, labor and capital seem to be involved in a relationship of transubstantiation. So, metaphorically speaking, labor then is subject to a kind of oppressive miracle. That it is productive is its curse. That it has a capacity is its burden. Because this capacity or this productivity or this capacity to create or whatever is actually something outside itself, which is this dead body of capital, which is machinery, which is building, which is whatever you might think of it. But this kind of language, this kind of imagery is precisely delusional, it is ideological. And the socialists are falling in that trap. This is Marx's political point. Proudhon is an example of that. So Proudhon at the end of all this says something which to Marx is ridiculous. Proudhon says, capital must never be loaned, because we are now entering the final question in Grundrisse, which is the question of surplus. That ultimately, if capital and labor are simply doing this between themselves, is it that what is presupposed, which is certain kinds of fundamental factors of production like labor, machinery, raw material and so on and so forth, at the end, the total composition of that is equal to the product. So 100 units to begin with, in different breakup, at the end the product is equal to 100 unit. But the actual fact is, and that indeed is the miracle of capitalism, that you actually get more than 100 unit. You get a surplus. So the great mystery of capitalism, where does this surplus come from? So one of the theories is that the surplus comes from something which is immoral. That is, and that's a long history of immorality, which is interest, sood pe paisa dena. So capital is a kind of interest-bearing loan, interest-bearing money. So capital actually makes money out of money. It's immoral because there's nothing behind it, according to some views. So Proudhon says that capital must not be loaned. Capital must not be loaned. Capital must be only used. And Marx says, but the definition of capital is that it is not to be used. It is to be it is to be precisely a kind of mediation. It is to be that thing which will survive mere usage. This is the whole point of capital. So your economic moralism is falsifying the very essence of capital, which is that capital is something which is reproduced on a larger scale. Capital is that which survives consumption, or meant to survive consumption. And you're saying, out of a kind of moral, economic morality, oh, capital must not be loaned, because loaning is immoral. So Marx actually not makes fun, but is very harsh towards Proudhon, and towards, by implication, a kind of socialistic morality. And finally, Marx, towards the end of this third notebook, speaks of the principle of labor, or this principle of labor as a historical principle, in terms of its consequences, which is institutional consequences. So the institutional consequences of a principle is that what emerges as a consequence becomes far more dominant in actual practice than the principle itself. So labor as a principle is the principle of creating what? A world of capital. And a world of capital is a world of a kind of capitalist state, forms of new bourgeois family, a whole panoply of social forms, each of which create major effects of power and major effects of inequality in our society. So to that extent, the principle itself becomes less and less important than its consequences. And again, to illustrate this point, Marx uses a very kind of intoxicating set of metaphors from Christianity. He says, look, we started out with God in Christianity, God. Then what happened? There are two sides to it, God and humanity, right? God creates humanity. But then comes a third, mediation, which is a kind of exchange between the two, but mediated by like a mediate form, like money in the case of the economy, something like money, which is Christ. So Christ mediates between God and humanity. But then, in history, Christ becomes more important than God. But then, as Christ becomes more important, the saints come into the picture. Because saints mediate the relationship of Christ and the rest of the Christian population. So saints become more important than Christ. But then when saints come into the picture, then the saints are eventually collected together in the church by the Pope. So the Pope becomes more important than the saints. And so goes the process. So it seems to me there is profound truth, which is a historical truth, in this notion of something which is a mediate, perpetual exchange, which at every moment of consumption or use survives the use and produces what Marx will in capital call a fetish. Commodity as a fetish form. Commodity which survives all specific qualities as a pure fetish form, one of which is labor. So in capital, it will in a sense come full circle. Labor itself is commodity, and the commodity form is fetishized or made into an absolute object, and to that extent, labor itself is made into an absolute object. So you can understand all the sentimentality with labor, but also the sphere of labor. So every path of change, every path of historical emancipation from this impasse, from this dialectic, from this contradiction, must both traverse and think and saturate the thought of labor, but also go beyond it. In that sense, free oneself from labor. This is by and large the theoretical idea that I will try and analyze in Marx and Ambedkar, but in two very different ways. I think that is enough for today. We can have questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, please, let's have questions, and I think we can stick around and listen to each other, because for me these questions might really change everything. If, you know, what I've said, I might just revise my propositions. It will be good for you to, you know, be here and help us through this process. That doesn't mean I'm forcing you to stay. Please go if you want. Yeah.
Do I need the mic? Am I loud enough? Mic. Thank you, Shomoda, for that very clear exposition on both Ambedkar and Marx's thought. I just have it's a problem for me, and possibly it's a very you know, it's just a very small thing, but maybe, you know, help me understand. You did say that Ambedkar's organization, the ILP, was concerned about making available to the depressed classes the principle of labor. But you also did mention how for caste labor, what is required or what is expected is ontological availability. Would it, I mean, is there not a contradiction there then, that where one mentions ontological availability, then it will not be as indifferent to the end of labor as the principle of labor would suggest?
This is a very important question. So, the availability of a principle of labor for Ambedkar, for that is the untouchable castes who are excluded from the principle, is a demand to be available in modern society to then enter into an alienated experience. So, as such, the principle of labor does not ensure justice or equality. No, it makes available progressive forms of injustice, if I may put it like that. So, it's an ironic demand. It is clearly, Ambedkar is aware of this irony. It's an ironic demand. But that ironic demand is important, and there Marx and Ambedkar are very close to each other. Both think that there is a threshold of desubjectification necessary. For Marx, the desubjectification has to happen at the level of the workers themselves. For Ambedkar, more urgently, it has to happen at the level of the village system. So it's an ironic, so I'll talk about it as we go along, but I'll be brief today. It is an ironic praise of a modern life. It is not an uncritical acceptance of modern life. So people who say that Ambedkar was someone who simply wanted modern life and industry, and to that extent he was kind of a capitalistic, are not reading him, Yeah. Please take the mic, because I think it will be easier for everyone else to hear. Yeah. We have to come to this.
Yeah. Shoma, thank you for the lecture. I agree with your proposition that labor is historic. But I think this would be ahistoric to argue that labor is historic. In the Ambedkarite reading of labor, see, labor would be sociological and anthropological. In the Indian version of labor, labor is more of a ritual. See, you know, you have argued that labor is kind of service. But in caste, labor is not service. Service is positive, but in the idea of caste, labor is almost like a destitute. And once the being is a destitute, there is nothing positive. So how do we see the ontological service with regard to Marx and Ambedkar?
Thank you, Praveen. You're right to point this out, because what you point out are the incompleteness in my own exposition, because I left so many gaps, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to fill up some of those gaps. So I am not saying labor is historical. I'm saying the principle of labor. That is my argument. That is what I am proposing. Where are you, Praveen? I can't see you. Yeah, sorry. I'm not saying labor is historical. Labor, you're completely right. Labor is anthropological, it is sociological. Labor has its own social history.
So the principle is staggering, right?
No, so we must, here we understand the principle in the very specific sense of wage work, where the worker is free to sell his, in Marx's word, labor power Ambedkar doesn't use this term at that point, but it's clear that that is what he has in mind. That the person who is working must have the freedom to sell or choose to sell and not sell also his labor. That's the first point. In that sense, it's a very clear modern analytical step for Ambedkar. But there are huge problems to doing that, which is now comes to service. Now, there I completely agree with you. Service is labor only in the obvious sense that there is some labor involved there. But service, as understood positively as part of social systems, which is part of which is also tradition, of course, is to be, and that's why I would like to do this more in a more detailed way later. Today I'll just hint towards it. It actually has to be deepened to different kinds of services. So ritual is a very important part of it, but not just ritual. Ritual itself has its different sites. So one thing which interests me so much is ritual as differentiated between religious ritual, between the sense of cultural ritual, which can include relatively non-religious sites, which can be, say, performance, artistic performance, and then military. Very importantly, military service as a ritual, but not religious necessarily, but a kind of military political ritual. Each of them has clearly a caste logic. And the Mahar, in a way, comes from that deep history. And Ambedkar is also wanting to exit that history by, and that is very important, by transforming the traditional forms into new modern emancipatory forms, where a form of education as anti-ritualistic is available to the Mahar more than the other untouchable castes at that time. And his father is an example of that. So you're completely right. There, each of them has to be taken into account, and they all seem to have positive, kind of, in their own times, a kind of positive value. But positive value from whom? There, again, a dialectic emerges, it seems to be. Positive value for the Brahmins, surely, because the Brahmins want to also make the non-Brahminical caste, particularly the untouchable caste, perform according to what is considered positive in the eyes of God, in the eyes of society, in the eyes of even some sort of sense of a kind of unconscious obedience to the hereditary mastery. That, you know, I'm born into this kind of hereditary obedience to the master of the. So that kind of positive, of course, that you're right. A certain kind of revolt can also come from a positive value. Not just from the anti-capitalistic, ironic understanding of labor. Labor itself can become the locus of a kind of revolt. That is completely true. And there is a history of such revolts in the history of India as well as in the history of the West. In different ways, of course. But a history of labor is revolt. And service itself is revolt. So we should undertake that genealogy of service as revolt. Nevertheless, we are looking at a very specific conjuncture where Marx and Ambedkar, Marx, not here Marx, but Ambedkar in 1936, is looking at the problem of a modern form of subjectivity which is tending towards citizenship clearly, and yet it is rooted in something which he considers, in his own words, a village system. So that is the site where I'm just beginning the exploration. But in beginning the exploration, I'm not saying I'll stick to it only. I'll have to deepen it, and you're right. Thanks.
So what about, one second. What about the...
Just let's finish.
What about the labor as destitute for Ambedkar?
So labor as destitute is very close to the language of immiseration. In Marx's Capital, at the last part, what does he write? He says that capitalism makes labor it plunges them in immiseration. So, like I myself said, it's a kind of denudation. It's a kind of absolute poverty. So, of course, absolutely. So that denudation or that destitution. But this is very important. I will talk about it later. But it's a question of land also, you see. It's not just a question of labor. It's also a question of land. One of the things that happens between ILP and HCF is one relationship to land has to be forced out of tradition and the modern state, which is something like a movement from the right to colonize empty land, the right to colonize land which is also upper caste land sometimes, and make separate settlements for untouchables, and then to rationalize it and enforce state nationalization of land. So in that trajectory, and this is happening between ILP and HCF, yeah, in this trajectory, there is something which actually is asking for a kind of fullness of the being of labor, not on the grounds of labor, but on the grounds of land. And land, again, not understood merely as factor of economic production, but land understood as a kind of not nativity at all, I don't agree with that, but land understood as a kind of symbiosis with an existence in a kind of communitarian autonomy. So why does he again and again speak of separate settlements and the right to colonization of land? It is not just an economic idea, it is a kind of communitarian idea. So yes, that is something, but I will talk about it later. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So just one clarification I needed was when you say that Marx wanted to establish the concept of class because it was non-existent. But another manifesto of the ILP was to also address the Brahminical tendencies of the existing working class. So I don't understand. If there is no class, so to speak, in the Ambedkarite sense, so what is this entity of which what is this entity which has to be de-Brahmanized?
Some confusion here. There's some confusion here. Marx did not say that he wants to establish. Yeah, Ambedkar wants to enforce something which is a relatively universal form, which is the form of class based on wage work at that point, and at the same time not take it as given in the system, in the early system of Indian capitalism, but something which in that experience is a divisive or a heterogeneous experience, which is the experience between the depressed classes and the upper caste workers. But this is not an absolute schism also. So ILP is an organization which is trying to find a way not out of it, but a way through it by enforcing such a principle. So, there's a wager here. There is a gamble here. Maybe that gamble fails, maybe it half succeeds, I do not know. But there's a gamble. The gamble is that ILP will try to enforce some principle of universality of labor in a divisive situation, and it will do it point to point, side to side. So in certain sites, it will enter into a larger unity with the upper caste workers also, and in certain sites, it will not leave its criticism of the upper caste. So it will not be a single policy, monotonous policy. It will be choosing side to side. So that's why the debate with M.N. Roy is so important. Because with M.N. Roy, what happens is he takes a third position, which is, he says that we must not go into a strike because right now the British government we must support because it is fighting an imperialist war, an anti-imperialist war, or in that anti-fascist war. Right? Yeah. And there, along with other workers, including upper caste workers, Ambedkar differs with M.N. Roy. He says, no, this is not a good principle at all. So there are many layers to these situations. We must go situation to situation, it seems to me. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Listening to you is always very stimulating in every sense of the term. I mean, more so methodologically, because the kind of methods that you bring to forth, I mean, the same content looks very different in a completely different light. So listening to you is always stimulating. I mean, I had two specific questions and one clarificatory question. So the first question is regarding this conceptualization of proletariat in terms of mass action. Okay. In terms of mass action. So, I mean, what is the modality of this mass action? The specific content of this mass action. I mean, is it of the Arendian sense that acting in concert, because you brought Arendt also in the discussion, and what is its specific relationship to violence? I mean, because Arendt will say something about that. One. Second is, what sort of mass action? I mean, a riot is also a mass action. A strike is also a mass action. What is, because you have been talking about principle, so what is the principle of mass action? That is one. The second is, you brought the example of the Vatan system.
Yeah.
In the context of, say, it was the 1936, a village of Maharashtra,
Yeah.
the Vatan system.
Yeah.
Now, traditionally, as we have understood in Marxism, that certain concepts have meaning within a structure, within a systemic reality.
Yeah.
So this Vatan system has a reality in a feudalistic structure. Now, posing this reality vis-a-vis a capitalist reality of a class or a wage labor, I mean, what is the history? What is the specificity of history? Because that is the problem. I mean, I also face in the introduction of the book that you have written, the speculative philology that you employ. So what is the historicity? What happens to history there? Two. And the third is the clarificatory question. You suggest that you say that labor becomes thinkable only when it is at its poorest. So I could not get the sense as to what you were saying.
So, again,
These are very, very, very important questions, very difficult questions. I might forget, some of the details of the question. Let's take it very quickly, one by one. Mass action, proletariat as mass action, is a judgment which appears to us through these specific writers, Hugo Tinker, and Dhananjaki doesn't use proletariat at all, he wouldn't, but some imagery is there. So it is still at a very nascent stage. We need to find out what it could mean. So that's exactly the kind of exploration or investigation I'd like to do more and more. So we'll try to make it more concrete. Nevertheless, let's try out this kind of a hypothesis that this mass action is a particular point of intervention or a particular point of entering into a particular action. Now, your individual examples of riot, strike, now it's not a question of Ambedkar only, it's a question of the history of politics. It is difficult to find either a theoretical or even a categorical as well as practical algorithm. These days, this is a very fashionable word. A kind of algorithm for which one is part of proletariat action, which one is not. So even the word riot is a very contextual word. In our Indian context, because of the question of communal riot, it means something which is very specific and it clearly is a revulsive idea, it's a revolting idea. But if you read Marx himself, you read commentaries on Marx in the 19th century history, you read historians like Hobsbawm, E.B. Thompson, many others, then you actually get a history of workers' rights. Yeah. And those riots actually play a decisive role in enforcing sanctions on the powers that were at that time, both the capitalist power but also state power. So these are specific historical meanings which are very contextual. Now, the question of Ambedkar here is actually very important, because Ambedkar does not speak of violence as a prescription at all. In fact, he criticizes violence as a weak means in his last piece on Buddha and Marx, in 1956. He actually speaks of violence as a weaker idea than certain other ideas offered by Buddha. That discussion we'll have later. But he actually says it. Nevertheless, you see, this is something we have to keep in mind. Through Ambedkar's works repeatedly in AOC, in Annihilation of Caste, in several other places, he takes the example of Ireland, Northern Ireland. In fact, he uses this example also in his Constituent Assembly speech, when Ambedkar says that the untouchable caste, the depressed class, the scheduled castes are actually being very kind to the majority. That they are saying we'll go by legislative means, we'll go by constitutional means. We are asking for certain minority safeguards. But don't be so complacent about it. Remember Ireland, where they said that we are not interested in your safeguards. We want this entire system. And here Ambedkar uses a metaphor again, but a metaphor of violence, which is explode. That the system should explode, or it can explode. So in Ambedkar, there is a clear, realist consciousness of the structural violence of the situation. And if Ambedkar desists from offering violent strategies opposite, it's a choice, it's a strategy, it's a well-reasoned out choice on his part. But that does not mean that, so he's a completely different writer from, say, Gandhi or some. He does not, to use a psychoanalytic term, he does not disavow violence. You know, disavowing is to not see something where it is. Ambedkar sees it where it is. So if proletariat is also an idea which has its rationale in some kind of negativity, in some kind of structural violence, and proletarianization is a kind of conscious opposition to violence, which can also happen non-violently, then Ambedkar's idea of, or no, the imputation of a kind of proletariat to Ambedkar can have some meaning. Though, of course, it is a move that those people make, I would never make. I have never used that term, and I will probably not do it in the future. Now comes your criticism of my work in terms of historicity. Now, you're absolutely justified in arguing from your position. Now, you see, it seems to me that something like service, since, let's go to the example. I will not talk about my book because that's a different agenda. This question of service, now, you see, there's a bit of a circle in your position. The circle is that what is service, or how to understand service in terms of its logic. It belongs to a totality. That is a Marxist, very classical Marxist, almost orthodox Marxist concept. That all elements are elements of a totality. So service as something which is historically archaic, even backward, is part of a structure of patronage, and that is part of feudalism. The overall rationale of that totality is feudalism. So you speak of ism again. Now the trouble is that when you speak of the totality and look at its elements as part of the totality, isn't it circular? Can't you also say that what is feudalism? Which is constituted by a system of service. But the difficulty is the system of service has a certain kind of a life which is surviving beyond the totality in its classical coherence. When Ambedkar is talking of the village system, he is not talking of a self-enclosed feudal system either. Clearly, it is a feudal system which is, if it is a feudal system, if you want to use that term, which is in a dynamic interaction with the city system. So he's actually talking literally in Bombay and Maharashtra, which is not two different worlds, but a continuous to and fro between unequal and yet connected parts of the same world. So Ambedkar is taking that real experience into account. Now, if you were to say feudalism, then you would have to do what Marxists do all the time, which is to say semi-feudal or remnants of feudal. So you will say that some parts of it are remnants from an earlier age. Now, no problem. Granted, it's a remnant. But it still does not answer the question, the endurance of the remnant. And sometimes the remnant dominates the new totality. Then you can't say that, oh, it's still the remnant. The remnant is an effective reality. So my hypothesis is, and that's why I'm working on this theme with all of you, that service is, if it's a remnant, it is a living, effective remnant to the point that it dominates the modern system. You can't think of modernity without the remnant. To that extent, it is modern. So it is this heterogeneous idea of what we call modern, instead of a very sort of a very consistent totality that we call feudal or capitalist or something else, that it seems to me, from my side, is my methodological move. So yes.
Any other? Yeah.
Hello. Sir, don't you think that both Marx and Ambedkar were trapped in modernist epistemology?
And sorry, I can't quite follow what you're saying. Please.
Yeah, modernist epistemology. I'm saying that, don't you think that both Marx and Ambedkar were confined in modernist epistemology and kind of teleological understanding of progress.
Modernist, yes, but I don't use the word teleology at all. On the contrary, that again is a very partial and, to me, inadequate reading of both Marx and Ambedkar. I speak of an ironic modernity or an ironic understanding. So Marx is aware that capitalism is unjust, and yet Marx speaks of capitalism as a kind of progressive stage of the development of mode of production, development of set of techniques, choice of stuff like that. But he's equally aware that capitalism is unjust. It's exploitative. It is the most rigorous form of exploitation. So to that extent, we are speaking of something like an ironic idea of a totality. To go back to the term that he used, totality. Ironic totality, the totality which is inconsistent. And it is that very inconsistency which in a way opens up politics for Marx. So Marx himself is not actively involved in politics the way Ambedkar is, but he is involved in specific moments up to the Paris Commune. And in each of these stages, it's this irony of the epistemology that gives him a kind of chance to think of something like, in my language I call event, something like a possibility of change, rupture. In Ambedkar, in a very different way, and yet it seems to me this choice of a kind of modernist site, the city, is again an ironic response to something which is clearly a life of alienated existence. The city is not a communitarian or emancipatory necessarily. So again, it's a wrong reading to say Ambedkar was praising capitalism. What Ambedkar was doing was showing us the capacity which capitalism unleashes, but it's a capacity for alienation. So the capacity for alienation is equally something which has to be fought for. That's the irony in Ambedkar. Yeah.
So you mentioned abstract truth.
Abstract?
Abstract truth. I think.
Roots.
Truth.
Yeah.
Could you clarify for me what you mean by truth?
Yeah.
And differentiate with form and principle, if you don't mind.
No, truth here means of value. Truth is of value. So if I say that equality exists, then I can't show you. It's not the same thing as saying the chair exists. That is a chair. I can say that is a table. That is an elephant. Yeah, whatever. And you can verify whether it's true or not. But if I say equality exists, you can't verify it. But I will say it as with the value that it is true. So which means that value is something which is subjectively articulated as something that I invest my enunciation in, my emotion in. That's the subjective. It's a commitment. But of course, it is objective because it must be implemented. It must be, if it is true, then what happens? This is the question. If it is true, then the social system changes, the economic. So, the universal basic income example I took. If there is something like, even at the formal level, economic equality, then is universal basic income a good idea or not a good idea? These questions arise only when we act under the value of truth. But of course, it's a subjective relationship. But it's a relationship, it's a process, it's not arbitrary. So yes, that's the meaning of truth here.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Sir, caste for Ambedkar involved not only a division of labor but also a division of laborers.
Yes.
So in the caste system, there is a double alienation from the product that the caste body produces, but also the imputation of pollution and stigma with the caste body. So this is what I thought was behind Ambedkar's criticism of the Vatan system in the Jajmani relations. So it is divisive. But in Marx's insight of labor as a disposition, or as you said, how it transmutes labor into capital. There, I think the alienation is of a particular kind, where there is alienation of your product and loss of creativity, etc. Do you think the two forms of alienation are the same? Because,
no, they are not.
Because that is quite
they are not.
point.
No, they are not. That's the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. If they were saying the same thing, why should I, waste your time and mine? Absolutely. So that's the point. You're completely right. I didn't discuss. See, it's a class. If I said everything today, I would also have no tricks for my next. Yeah, very few tricks. So that's a main quotation. That's a main proposition. Not division. So I did mention his section 3 and 4, where division of occupation as a justification given for caste, and he will actually criticize that. He will expose that by saying it is not a division of labor; it's a division of laborers. Now this is absolutely crucial. So service is a division of laborers, which means precisely the exclusion of the principle of labor. Yeah. Exactly. But I will show it. Yeah, in the next few classes. I'll show it. Because otherwise, I'd just be making a summary statement. I want to show precisely what you're interested in India, which is that this division of laborer also produces very important modifications in the relationship of class that is not economic class, but social categories like the strata, social class, and the individual. So see what happens when it's a division of laborer. There is over long periods of time a coherence between the social class and the individual. So when you say lower caste, then you know the family, you know the identity of the community over a long period of time who will remain lower caste. So the category lower caste and the individual lower caste will be commensurate. This is not necessarily true of class, that is economic class. And this is a point we need to discuss about the relationship of caste and class in economic quota, the logic of economic quota. So this is something I'm going to talk about next, and not economic quota, but the concept. In Grundrisse, Marx speaks of the abstraction, the capitalist, the abstraction, the worker. He says this does not necessarily include the real workers and the real capitalists, because those are flickering, those are unstable. But the abstraction of the capitalist and the abstraction of the worker are absolutely rigorous. Yeah, this is different in caste. In caste, the abstraction of lower caste and the real lower caste are commensurate. This is something which has absolutely not been thought about in the new quota. But that's something I would like us to do later. But yes, that's my response. Yeah, I see. That's a lot. Yes. Anything more? All right. Oh, thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.